Well, we're in Psalm 18, uh, crawling through at my normal pace. Um, and last time we just looked at the first phrase, I love you, Lord. One quick thing on that. And if you are looking at your own Bible, Lord is in small caps. And you probably know this already, but whenever that is the case, this indicates that for the English translation, they use the word Lord in small caps like that for when in Hebrew it would have been Yahweh or some form of that, which is a transliteration that the Hebrews used. Well, it goes back to the first commandment. You'll have no other gods before me. And then the third commandment, you will not misuse the name of the Lord your God. The Israelites, the Hebrews, were deadly serious about not misusing the name of the Lord. So they wouldn't use it at all. This was the name that God expressed to Moses, and then Moses expressed to them, I am. Uh, well, whatever that word was, we don't have it anymore because they changed it to Yahweh, uh, the Lord Almighty, God Almighty, and our version of Lord. Now, that original was called the Tetragrammatron, which, if you ever get on Jeopardy, the odds aren't very favorable that they're going to ask you about that. But if they do, you can say, oh, why, that's the Tetragrammatron. Okay, the Lord. Then he says, you are my strength. I'm going to camp out here a little bit. And the reason is because of my experience. This is one of those times I don't want to make you guilty of my weakness or my sin, but I don't think I am. I think we all share this. I do not like feeling weak. I especially don't like being perceived as weak. This is no surprise to anybody who knows me pretty well, but I am not good at asking for help. I love helping others. It strokes my ego. I feel fulfilled. I mean, there's half a dozen dark reasons why I like helping people. But I don't like asking for help. I don't like to seem weak. I don't like it when I feel weak. You know what's at the heart of that? For me, maybe for you, pride. Just plain old pride. When I frame it up in that way, it gets kind of ugly. Well, no, not even kind of ugly. It gets ugly. Pride, well, think about this. James and Peter both use this idea in their letters in the New Testament, but James says, God opposes or resists the proud, but gives grace to the humble. And Peter says essentially the same thing. I know I want and need God's grace. How does that happen? Well, it happens as a result of humility. God's grace, He gives grace to the humble. My pride then sets me up to be unavailable. Maybe that's one of the ways I would say it, unavailable for God's grace. One of the reasons for this, and I'm sure this is not, it's way not, here's the full and final explanation, but one of the reasons is grace assumes two things. One is the ability of the giver and the capacity of the giver, right? And secondly, the need of the recipient. Pride says, I don't need. I can do it myself. Now, for a 2 or 3-year-old, that's part of them growing individuation and appropriate independence in their little bitty lives. But for people my age, I can do it myself. I mean, there are things I can do myself, and I should do myself, right? But if that frame of mind keeps me from being humble enough to admit I need help, that kind of pride, I see this in the Pharisees, and I've talked about this before, so I'm not going to dwell on it, but I think the Pharisees became legalists. And if you look at the whole history of the movement of the Pharisees, they began as a sincere, legitimate movement to return to God's design and urge Israel to return. And in part of that, they became combatants against the Roman Empire in Jerusalem. Well, by the time Jesus came on the scene, and before that even, they had become, in my opinion, worshipers of the law, not so much worshipers of God. And they prided themselves on their meticulous obedience to the law. My theory on why that was is that they didn't want to need grace, for crying out loud. I will obey the law. I will do so perfectly. And God won't have to trouble himself with pouring grace out for me. We'll save that for those people who really need it. I mean, Jesus told a parable about two men that went up to the temple to pray. One was a tax collector. And in Jesus' day, almost nobody had worse reputation in the community than the tax collector. This was not even the IRS, right? I mean, most of us, I'm not thrilled to have the IRS pick apart my return. I suppose in some ways, many of us just really don't like the Internal Revenue Service. Well, that dislike is not nearly the kind of almost hatred of Roman tax collectors. Well, the King James Version calls him the publican. The more recent translations call him a tax collector. And the other was a Pharisee. The Pharisee prayed, "Oh God, I am thankful that I'm not like others. Others who are less committed, less good, less," I'm expanding the paraphrase there. And then he says, "or like this tax collector." Paraphrase, scum. The publican, the tax collector, prayed a simple prayer. God, have mercy on me, a sinner. two very different prayers from two very different kinds of people. And Jesus sums up this parable by saying, the publican went home justified. In my mind, the Pharisee only went home having his pride reinforced. So why am I talking about this? Because I struggle pretty continually to appropriately remind myself that my strength comes from the grace of God at work in my life. Remember, Paul writes that God gave him a thorn in the flesh. We don't even know what the thorn is. But he described his prayer. He said, 3 times I prayed for God, asking God to remove this thorn. And every time God said no. And then at the end of his reply was, my grace is enough for you. Okay, that's a good song. I love to sing it. It's a great idea. I like to tell people about it. I don't like it for me. I'd love it for you. And Paul goes on to say, so, because of this, I will glorify in my weakness, and God said, my strength is made perfect in your weakness. I love you, Lord. You are my strength. I'm not going to kid myself to say I'm tough enough. One of my very favorite U2 songs is Tough Enough. Yeah, you should listen to it. I have a very high regard for Bono. He's not perfect, not by a long shot, but man, as the main lyricist for U2, gosh, he's got some fabulous lyrics. And the whole idea of tough enough is you don't have to be tough enough. We're in community. We love each other. We nurture each other. We help each other. But if you're tough enough, you don't need any help. It's a crummy way to live. Look around at your own life at seasons that you were tough enough. How'd that work for you? I can only tell you how it worked for me. Not well. Because eventually, God's permission or God's command make life tougher than me. David writes, I love you, Lord. You are my strength. If I truly believe that God is my strength, and I get to just sit back in the recliner and let it happen. No. If you know anything about David, that's not how he lived his life, and that's not what this strength is about. It is about me partnering with God, but I'm a silent partner, and He provides the strength I need. I find this easy to believe for other people, difficult to believe for myself. But this is a great reminder. I love you, Lord. You are my strength. See you next time on So Care with Stevie Boy.